Good evening. This is lecture two in our study of World War II. And this lecture is going to focus on various groups um, that participated during World War II. If you look at the picture on the very first slide, this is a picture of the World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C. I recommend going to check it out if you ever have an opportunity to go into Washington, D.C. It is definitely something to see. So you can divide the important groups that participated during World War II into six separate groups. The first one, obviously, is the American military. The next one is women who participated during World War II. The next one is the Tuskegee Airmen. The next one is the Navajo Code Talkers. The next one is the 442nd Unit. And the last one is the Manhattan Project. So before the United States enters the war, Congress approves the first peacetime draft in the nation's history. This could have been for a number of reasons. I think the most obvious one is because they probably felt like the United States was going to end up in another world conflict. The numbers of soldiers drafted was pretty overwhelming. And the term GI, as in like GI Joe, comes from the initials on their uniform, which meant government issue. And most of these soldiers went through just 8 weeks of basic training, and then they would be shipped off to war. So not a long time, to sort of get prepared for battle. That's Batman. These are pictures of family members sort of waving goodbye to the soldiers going off to war. At the beginning of the war, the United States military was completely segregated. African Americans were organized into their own military units with white officers in command. In the Army, African Americans also performed well, receiving various awards for distinction or distinguished service. But segregation did not end during the war, but it did lead to full military integration in 1948. In 1941, the American troops were untrained. They had very little military experience. They did, however, get the job done and suffered the fewest casualties in combat of all the major powers in the war. Russia actually is the one country that suffers the most casualties. Or I guess the Soviet Union is a more accurate name for what is now Russia. Don't worry about this. So one important group that fought with distinction during World War II were known as the Tuskegee Airmen. Remember, African Americans were segregated during World War II, but the Tuskegee Airmen were a group of African American fighter pilots. Um, what what ends up happening is the African Americans weren't allowed to learn to fly until 1941, but then a group of African American college graduates were selected to participate in what is sort of like what was sort of an experiment. Um, the Army Air Force turned the experiment into the 99th Pursuit Squadron, the first African American unit, and these are known as the Tuskegee Airmen. If any of you guys have seen the movie Red Tails, this is what uh, that movie was based off of. Also, there's another movie uh, called the Tuskegee Airmen. There's also a Tuskegee Institute, which is a college. You don't need to read this, but it's just a little story. When Eleanor Roosevelt visited the Tuskegee Airmen, she wanted to fly in a plane. She insisted on having a black pilot as the the pilot in her plane, and this is a picture of her flying. And she used this photograph to sort of convince her husband FDR to integrate the military. In 1943, the Tuskegee Airmen flew into combat in North Africa. They were involved in over 15,000 attacks and completed uh, over 1,500 missions. They never lost an American bomber to enemy fighters. And when they returned, they had earned 150 Distinguished Flying Crosses, Legion of Merit, and the Red Star of Yugoslavia. So there's a lot of awards. And the fact that they never lost any bombers was pretty impressive. I mean, if you look at any of the other units who fought during World War II, um, the the bombers themselves would be shot down like constantly. So the fact that they didn't lose any is rather impressive. And that's a picture of their red tails. That's why the movie Red Tails is called that. Don't worry about that. The next part is women in the war. So during World War II, Congress establishes the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. Um, the Coast Guard, Navy, and Marines quickly followed and set up their own uh, women's units, but they were banned from combat. In addition to the military, 68,000 women served as nurses. Next group is the Navajo Code Talkers. The Navajo Code Talkers were a group of Navajo Native Americans. They comprised over 400 service members in the Marines. And not much was known about what they did during World War II until uh, a while after the war. The Navajo language is a very complicated language to learn, and it was complicated for the Japanese military to figure out what the Navajo code talkers were saying. So they had a great advantage in being able to communicate with one another. This is an example or the picture of them all. Not all of them, but it was so like I said, they transmitted vital messages during the war, and it was the only unbreakable military code. It's my boy Barry. Don't worry about that. The next group is the 442nd Regiment, which is an all-Japanese regiment during World War II. So in May 1943, 1,500 Japanese Americans volunteer from the mainland and 3,000 from Hawaii assembled for camp in Mississippi. In less than 2 years of combat, the 442nd Regiment earned 18,000 honors, which is pretty impressive, and is one of the most decorated units in military history. So, as we will learn later on, many of Japanese Americans were placed in what are called internment camps during World War II. Uh, 2 years later, the military starts to allow Japanese Americans to participate in the military. The last group is the Manhattan Project. What the Manhattan Project was, it's a top secret program uh, led by a man named General Groves. Groves organizes a team of engineers and scientists to build an atomic bomb. Their secret laboratory is in New Mexico. And let's skip that. So what does the bomb do? The atomic bombs were either uranium or plutonium based, and it involved fission, which is splitting atoms, or fusion, which is joining the atomic nuclei. The bombs were designed to be detonated about 1,900 feet in the sky. The explosions themselves generated heat that was about 3,900 degrees Celsius, and winds that were about 1,000 kilometers an hour, which is pretty crazy, and extreme radiation. Many of the people who were killed by the atomic bomb were instantly vaporized. Don't worry about that. And that is it.